Hello, everybody. Here's the second panel and the last one of the conference. And so let me introduce our last guest. This is, on my right side, is Professor David Abraham, who's a lawyer, but historian first. He studied history at the University of Chicago, and then law at the University of Pennsylvania. And my second guest is Klaus Offe, very frequent guest in Poland and translated to Polish and of course to many other languages. He's a sociologist, political sociologist, studied in Frankfurt. So I don't know actually what generation of Frankfurter Schule you are. Second, fourth, I saw many. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter, okay. Both our guests are, so to speak, transitologists. They touch the question of transformation in the age of globalization from different sides. So Klaus is analyzing the social institutions like a state, capitalism, and others. And Professor Abraham, I think your recent interest pertains to the topic of citizenship in the era of globalization. Am I correct? You see, I'm correct. My name is Sławomir Sierakowski. I'm going to host this panel. Klaus made me an offer that I couldn't refuse to host it. And we will do what I heard is that there is a variety of forms how the previous panels were arranged. We're going to do like this. So first kickoff remarks we're going to get from Professor Abraham. Then from Professor Offe, and then I will ask some questions, and then you will ask some questions. And the topic of our discussion is a little bit surprising to me, left-wing radicalism and the issue of solidarity. As the new one we have? You changed it. Okay. I'm not surprised that you changed it. I don't see any left-wing radicalism. Though, David, not though, but... All right, sounds more interesting. Come on, we're prepared for this one as well. The following one is Liberalism, Populism, and the Challenges of Post-Transformation in Eastern Europe and Elsewhere. Okay. Let it be. Professor Abraham, take the floor.
Thank you. Let's not make too much of the title because we're going to be talking about different things in any event. So being the last panel is a little bit like being the speaker before dinner. Everybody wants to move on. So I hope we can make it worth your while to have stayed with us to the end. In one of our opening night dinner toasts, we heard that solidarity was the readiness to share with both these, excuse me, let me get that right. We heard that solidarity was the readiness to share things with others with whom we have something in common. So this very pregnant formulation leaves out the question of with whom do we have things in common? What is the basis of this solidarity? Who is the circle of the we who can belong? And we have seen in the last year or two the continuing and exacerbation of the crisis of the welfare state, which was described so acutely in the preceding panel by Mr. Leisegang and all the panelists actually, describing the crisis of the hardware of the welfare state. The immigration crisis, or migration crisis, has highlighted for us some of the crisis of the software, of the apps of the welfare state, namely the definition of who is a member of the historic or civic community to which we owe this solidarity, with whom we are willing to share, whom we trust, whom we will tolerate. These are issues that make the hardware work more effectively or less effectively. So I want to use Angela Merkel over the last 8 or 10 months as an example of the reassessment of this circle of the we. It's a bit of a cliche already to claim that Merkel a year ago abandoned the Weberian ethic of responsibility, Verantwortungsethik, in favor of a more open ethic of ultimate ends, or Gesinnungsethik, and that in doing so, she unleashed what another German politician, Wolfgang Schäuble, said was the careless skier who caused an avalanche. We may remember it wasn't all that long ago that she was Time magazine's 2015 Chancellor of the World. People talked about her, the ongoing German commitment to coming to terms with the past, Vergangenheitsbewältigung, the Christian love of her parental home, the needs of the German labor market, all of which produced a kind of open sense of Wir schaffen das. Of course, as has been pointed out, it wasn't clear what the das was and what would be a measure of schaffen, and let alone who the wir in the end is going to be. In the months that have come since then, we've seen a shift to, on her part, and of that of the political class, to the ethic of responsibility, which acknowledges some international legal responsibility to help refugees, but considers first the impact on the receiving society of receiving 1 million strangers, the impact on the sending societies, on the transit countries, and the incentive effects on present and future refugees and migrants. These sorts of calculations are without doubt going to narrow the circle of the we and move us back from the kind of global justice concerns, which were at the center of liberal thinking over the last generation. I'll say a bit more about that momentarily. Back to a more historic conception of the we. And historic is one of the nicer ways to put it. So this concern has moved to the center, and I can't help but quote, of all people here, Lawrence Summers, the former U.S. Treasury Secretary and one of the instantiations of globalism, who recently wrote in the Financial Times, and I quote, "The willingness of people to be intimidated by experts into supporting cosmopolitan outcomes appears exhausted. The basic responsibility of government is to maximize the welfare of citizens, not to pursue some abstract concept of the global good. People also want to feel that they are shaping their societies." Lawrence Summers. He concludes, "Intrusions into sovereignty exact a high cost. What is needed now is a responsible nationalism." So this is the view to which the political middle has moved. And on the right, of course, we've seen things much less appealing. So Frauke Petry, the head of the Alternative for Germany, just a few weeks ago to celebrate her election victories, thought that it was time to revalidate the word folkish, a word that had been driven into complete disrepute by Nazism, but which everyone knows carries a very ethno-nationalist conception of the people. We have seen the return of words that were long banished to the relative margins, like culture, as an obvious norm instead of as a conservative agenda. Mainstream culture is a kind of generous translation of like culture. Zusammengehörigkeitsgefühl, a concept, the feeling of belonging together, a concept which Weber developed in a highly constructivist conception of who the we are, very way beyond Benedict Anderson, a very constructivist notion. But as we heard in the last panel, Mitterrand said that kind of nationalism produces war, and both Durkheim and Weber, of course, as they obsessed with concerns about solidarity, were also deeply in the pre-war moment. But the global justice concerns of the last generation were so broad that even John Rawls, who was quoted so favorably the other night, The next generation of Rawlsians, his students, dissociated themselves from his book, The Law of Peoples, which was a very sovereigntist, left liberal sovereigntist perspective, and called for a more overtly global justice perspective. Liberal thinkers were unable to answer the question, if one person is born in San Diego, California, and someone 10 miles away in Tijuana, Mexico, what liberal justification can there possibly be for prohibiting the latter from trying to enjoy the benefits of the former? And the liberal left was unable to provide an answer to that. And the development, which I think in some ways began already with Willy Brandt's North-South concerns, developed further. The notion that the nation state was both the integument, the framework, and the machine for delivering social justice receded. And it's now coming back, and it's coming back with a vengeance. There were some alternatives. Some of us will remember Jacques Delors and a kind of Christian human rightsy social justice conception, at least for the EU, but that didn't get anywhere. And instead, the model that the EU, at least before 1990, in some respects afterwards as well, built on for its definitions of who belongs, was a kind of broad, diluted version of Habermasian Verfassungspatriotismus. Civic nationalism, loyalty to both the substance of the Constitution and the methodology of rational debate, representation, etc. A bit formalistic and proceduralistic, but nonetheless it enjoyed leading, if not hegemonic, status, at least in liberal and left circles. Alternatives which had been in the air earlier, for example, the serious German Catholic legal thinker Ernst Wolfgang Bockenförde, who talked about homogeneity, were kind of brushed aside, or Bockenförde claimed that they were verdrängt because people did not want to confront the need for some kind of homogeneity in society to help create the identities that would allow people to share material goods with each other, to trust each other, to go beyond the civil rights of toleration, but to actually pay for the social rights enjoyed by others. Now, it's obviously true that lots of things are involved. Constitutions, laws, political platforms, class identities, trade unions, civil society organizations, all of these are involved in this part of the software of the welfare state. But the immigration crisis has highlighted for us this particular topic, difficult one. We can all talk about the historical communities, but when we try to take apart what that means, we come across conceptions that make us as liberal less comfortable, namely pre-political things like ethnicity, like culture, like intense shared experiences which have slowly dissipated from society, like the levée en masse, like the mass industrial workplace, which was itself a kind of melting pot. Instead, we have developed societies in which difference has been valued as a liberal principle, but now is coming back in some ways to haunt us as the levels of social solidarity that have helped the welfare state seem to be suffering. The borders and bonds of citizenship, seem to weaken in diverse multicultural societies. I know that's a contested statement to make, but there seems to be a lot of evidence coming from right, center, and left alike, to name only a few, Putnam, Berry, Koopmans, and a host of other sociologists who have, I think, fairly convincingly made the argument that the willingness to share declines, that immigration absent intensive integration leads to less and less willingness to share. In some ways, the United States has it easier since we have a much weaker welfare state regime. We offer a level playing field, but no one gets a ladder. So the level playing field is an easier one in which to tolerate difference, immigration, lower levels of social solidarity. But the European experience demanding more sharing is one more vulnerable to these developments. So far, we have seen mostly the populist hostility based on a kind of ethnic privilege that people in titular nations are unwilling to surrender. But I think this other aspect that the immigration crisis has highlighted is one that we need to take seriously if we are to combat the kind of hunkering down and disaggregation of the social solidarity that the welfare state both lived from and helped to reinforce, that the liberal left's attitude toward integration and immigration and integration needs some revision. And I'll stop my introductory remarks there, and we'll come back, talk about it some more.
Okay. We have deliberately not coordinated our introductory remarks, but it turns out that I plan to start, and I will start with exactly the same question. Ulrike Gero yesterday morning took the liberty, I would say, to translate the concept of solidarity by using the French Revolution fraternité. Fraternité, of course, is a normative mandate to share with whom? With, and that is the metaphor, with the members of your own family, your brothers and maybe sisters. Fraternité, and the nation is an analogy to the family. Both of these institutions are the only ones that are interminable, lasting forever by intention, right? So the nation and the family provide the apparent model for the community of those who are committed to sharing among them. That is rather worthless as a model, because we live in societies, in modern societies, where collectivities are not given. They are open, they need definition, and they are contested. Whom are we supposed to share with? In our type of societies, we have an entire portfolio of identities or reference groups that we may want or may refuse to share with. Membership is optional, and with the reference unit that we choose to rely upon and to follow, change the interests that we pursue. We are, in a way, all multiple personalities. Each of us consists at least of the four persons that Robert Reich once distinguished, namely we are workers, we are consumers, we are savers or investors, and we are citizens. And depending on what reference unit we choose for the moment, our interests are very different, can be very different, and there is no clear hierarchy of what comes first and what is less important. We can also say we belong to a certain generation or age cohort. We are parents or not parents. We are fans of Borussia Dortmund and many other identities to choose from and to practice solidarity for. And this uncertainty of collectivities, of relevant collectivities, is something that causes confusion and often panic, and I come back to that. Before that, I want to say something about the liberal model of the individual. The liberal model of the individual is self-responsibility. Everything I become or became and are likely to become in the future is due to my own effort and my own strengths or weakness, and I have to be responsible, and I will be held responsible for myself. This is a model that is profoundly obsolete. Let me give you an example for illustration. There's a famous book, Untitled Chapter, with the title, The Birthright Lottery. What is the strongest predictor for a person's lifetime income? What is the strongest predictor for a person's lifetime income? The answer is his or her place of birth. That is the variable in human existence that no one can be held responsible for, right? Obviously not. And similarly, the concept of well-being or welfare has been rightly de-individualized. It used to be the case that the welfare of a person is considered a dependent variable of his or her income. Not so. Many aspects of our welfare are created by conditions that we have not been responsible for, such as social security, or of civic security, or the infrastructure. And the tendency or the habit or the misleading practice of measuring persons' welfare in terms of their income needs to be overcome. It is our well-being is at a minimum co-produced by many conditions that we have not created but are benefit from, such as the welfare state. So, given this portfolio of identities and reference units, there is a dominant quest for certainty. Who are we? The title of the last book, I think, of Sam Huntington. And the most primitive, the most elementary answer to that, the smallest common denominator that has become so prominent in today's politics and movements is our ethnic belonging. This is the fallback position when we are not certain. This is also something that Ralph Dahrendorf pointed out in a recent, in one of his last articles, that the disorganization of identities leads to the only apparently certain fallback position, namely ethnic identity, which, however, which fuels today's rightist populist movements and politics. And this rightist populist movements and identity politics is highly exclusivist. Solidarity is practiced among the Volksgenossen, the people who belong to the same ethnic identity and is denied to everyone else. The problem is, what is the right collectivity? And one tentative answer that I want to briefly discuss here is that we forget about, as Ulrike Gero actually proposed to do, forget about traditional identities and answer the question in a quasi-functionalist way. The reference community that we owe sharing and solidarity to is all those who depend on us and on whom we depend. It's interdependency rather than a given identity. Given this interdependency, and you could illustrate that by European Union examples, the obligation of practicing solidarity would pertain to all those whom we are sharing a common fate with. And for this community applies the principle that your well-being makes me better off. So I have rational reasons to contribute to your well-being because we are interdependent. Your absence of well-being has negative consequences for me and vice versa. There are, however, and that needs also to be highlighted in a critical perspective if we talk about the commons and the common good as if it were something that is self-understood and self-explanatory. We need to realize that there are cases of deceptive common goods or asymmetrical common goods. The euro is a common good, however, for some much better than for others. It saves on transaction costs in international trade. However, some are free to practice export surpluses of 8.5% of GDP, as this happens to be the case in Germany. And some suffer because their hands are tied, they cannot determine their own interest rates, and they cannot determine their own exchange rates. The monetary regime is a collective good, a common good, but it benefits some much more than others. And for some, for instance, Greece, the benefits are quite debatable. So the same with cultural heritage that was mentioned yesterday. It can be, if that means opera houses, it serves a particular subset of the constituency rather than everyone in the same way. It is comparable, the collective goods, asymmetrical collective goods or common goods are comparable to a lunch buffet with vegetarian food only. It serves all have access, but the meat eaters are obviously not served as well as the others. Let us look at the example of Social Security. Today, and taking together the 2 points that I've made so far, Social Security used to be a project and an accomplishment of social democratic welfare states. What has been a continuous theme in our debates is the slow, or in some cases not so slow, breakdown or disappearance of social democracy. And I think the rightist populist definition of with whom we need to share and whom we do owe nothing has to do with the evaporation of social democracy. And there's a simple substitution mechanism going on. What used to be accomplished through social democratic controlled, including in a very broad sense, including Christian democratic welfare states, is now, according to the principles and the propaganda and the proposals of the populist right, to be accomplished not through state power, but through state borders. State borders are a protective device that protects us from the inflow of various things: foreign goods, foreign gods, foreign people, foreign investment, foreign authority, and foreign information. All these things are to be kept out through strengthening of borders, through the building of fences, through the establishment of a collective identity of solidarity that is fenced in and protected from outsiders. However, this is an ideology or a deceptive narrative about reality that is facing its hour of truth, its moment of truth. It cannot survive. It is unsustainable. It feels good, perhaps, for a while, but we are beyond the point where the retreat to national identity, ethnic national identity, is in any way long-term promising, because nations within the EU and far beyond are not independent. They are interdependent, and therefore the Visegrad syndrome of making a 180-degree U-turn. It used to be in the 90s, that was the slogan, back to Europe. Now it's away from Europe. This U-turn is not sustainable because the societies in question depend for their security, their international security, their economic well-being, and their internal integration, the social peace within them, upon the EU, the supranational organization that reflects the facts of interdependency, and you cannot redefine the relevant community in voluntaristic ways so as to rely on nationalism and ethnicity alone. It is simply a lie and the hour of truth is going to come. Thank you.
Okay, so let's first focus on the notion of liberalism. As it's not hard to guess, to have liberal democracy, we need liberals. And there is a famous example or anecdote of John Holbrook, who inspired or just or shocked by the war in Yugoslavia, said that imagine that we implement 5 adjective democracy procedures to the society consisted of chauvinists, xenophobics, populists. Of course, the outcome won't be rather a liberal democracy. And so this leads me to another notion, nationalism. And I wanted to ask you, what is so sustainable that nationalism didn't go through this post-ideological turn? Any other ideology, any other concept exists, but rather in a form of this post-way. So with the distance to it, like all of us who believe in, no matter like what kind of ideology you get, we we gained this postmodernist distance. Okay, it's not really easy to be fanatic today in the West. Look at Trump. Trump is not motivated by ideology. Probably this is why he's not gonna be. Maybe, I don't know, but probably this is why he will rather create a social, not the social, but media concern first, rather than social movement, like radical social movement, all right? But nationalism is something that it's really still exists in this old school form. So how, you can of course disagree with me, but if not, then like why, what is so sustainable in it?
It seems to me that Claus, citing Dahrendorf, pointed to ethnic nationalism as a kind of atavistic fallback, always available. So I think that's probably right. But on the other hand, Robert Reich is a kind of simplified version of his portfolio notion. It's a kind of simplified version. I recall an excellent essay Adam Przeworski wrote in the 1970s on Karl Kautsky and the problem of class formation. These are not random assignments of identity. I can choose to be a male or an American or an investor or whatever on a kind of random basis. There are social conditions that make some things possible and other things not possible. The reason I think nationalism is not simply an atavistic residue that emerges when the welfare state exhausts itself or social democracy dies or something like that. The fact is that we do live in ethnic historical communities, and when I think it was 1912, when the Socialist International met in Amsterdam, it was workers of the world unite, now go home and do your thing. I'm sure they didn't use the phrase do your thing, but go home and organize for socialism. So the fact is that these ethnic historic communities are not pure inventions. They were created as political entities, but the ethnic historical reality is there. And it seems to me that as an immigration scholar, that we can't ignore this. And that's why immigrants will shape the future of a country, but they are getting on board a boat which has already come from somewhere and has been sailing a long time, and they can help determine where it will sail in the future. It's a contingent and open historical formation, but we can't ignore that it is a historical formation. It does have a geography, it does have a history, it does have a prevailing language, and all of these things. Class was a very useful universalist formation. For Fason's patriotism was a very useful universalist formulation. And they were compatible, as Kautsky and others would have said, with the universal worker who represents increasingly the overwhelming majority of the society. But if we have all in the last 2 days acknowledged the twilight of social democracy, then we also have to take into account the twilight of those universalist identities that accompanied it, and work with things that are not just atavistic, but that are there all along and have to be negotiated differently in different phases of historical and economic development.
Just to express one thing, no matter what kind of definition, how strongly postmodern you will get, you mentioned Benedict Anderson, imagined community, nations as imagined community. Benedict Anderson never wrote something like that because it's a social construct, it's going to be very weak and flexible. No, it's not. It can be a social construct and extremely strong and hard. The same with Ernest Gellner and another definition givers. But so, but so how? What's going on with the nationalism? Especially because you don't see much analysis of it in contemporary humanities. Like we like lost the war theoretically, and we are losing practically with this.
What we need to explain is why is ethnicity so dominant as a category of collective action and negative collective action, namely collective action against or to the disadvantage of the non-belonging. Why is that so? So we have a choice. We can act as citizens rather than as members of a ethnically defined community. We can act as workers, although we heard this morning that 15% in Britain, if I remember rightly, people in Britain count themselves as members of the working class. So there is a deep confusion and often a panic about what we mean by we. And nothing is given here, and it has become a practice among people like us, if we are in the United States or elsewhere abroad, that we describe ourselves as Europeans rather than members of a nation state within the European Union. So it is to a large extent optional. Of course, there are strong interests connected with one or the other of these self-descriptions of the relevant communities and references for solidarity, but they are not fixed. And also, if you speak of, David, of immigration in the life history of an immigrant is a transient phenomenon. At latest, his or her grandchildren are no longer recognizable in most cases as immigrants, as having, as the German terminology and the Austrian terminology, as a migration background, right? So it's entirely arbitrary that in Germany the official statistics counts as a person having a migration background, everyone born after 1950 with one parent not being born in Germany, right? And that makes 20% of the resident population. If you take 1910 as a cutoff point for that statistic, you would easily arrive at 60%. So it is a transitory phenomenon to be a migrant in the longitudinal perspective. And what we need to explain again is why this category, this dangerous, exclusivist and conflictual category has become so dominant, and what we can do against this becoming ever more dominant.
Okay, so actually nationalism for us means more or less something like, let's put it this way, homogeneity, and also in your previous remarks. I had a, like, it leads me, or like, it reminds me the talk with Michael Walzer that I had a few days ago, and I asked him if Trump is the first far-right European politician in American politics. He is anti-immigrant, he's pro-Russian, and there are many other features that makes Trump like similar or like in the same range with Front National and other populist, right-wing populist parties. And even Ulrike Geru, if she gave this definition of solidarity as a fraternité, actually it sounds also like pretty ethnic homogenic. And there is, you mentioned also some founding fathers like Durkheim, Weber. There is like founding, maybe uncle, not a father, Georg Simmel, who gave a definition, like a different definition of solidarity, or or like I would give a different. Solidarity for me means, and not only for me, for many other people, trust. And Zimmer said that trust is something like both, something more and less than knowledge. You can also say that it's something more or less than certainty. With losing homogeneity, we're losing certainty. What is common for America and for Europe, and this is why Walzer opposed this putting Trump or Europeanizing Trump. He said that it's not necessarily nationalism or European nationalism that Trump is doing in America is a problem that Americans, white working class, is losing this question of certainty, losing this certainty about being at home, being at their own place. So, and you have also many theories that are explaining the dismantle of welfare state by losing homogeneity. You don't want to pay taxes for someone that it's not like you, that it's not the same as you. So maybe nationalism is much more sociobiological question than we thought before. And maybe we're like, I don't know, maybe we're going, or maybe we should like, unfortunately, recall this social biological paradigm to humanities that we like forgot like many years ago.
Well, crises lead people to want to sharpen the line between inside and outside. No artist or mathematician has ever described an inside that didn't have an outside. There's always a reference to outside. And crisis leads us to push more people outside. Despite being an immigration country, the United States certainly has a cyclical record of anti-immigrant sentiment. But I wouldn't put the emphasis here so much on immigration as on integration. So at a time when Sicilians, Poles, Irish came massively to the United States, when the Turkish Gastarbeiter came to Germany, we put them in mines, we put them in steel mills, and the process of integration took place around the labor movement, took place around the homogenizing process, which could take peasants and turn them into Frenchmen, into citizens, into Americans. Today, that's much more difficult. Angela Merkel initially had the support of the Arbeitgeberverbände in Germany, who thought that the demographic and labor market problems would be solved. And then they realized that these are mostly uprooted peasants who can't solve that problem anymore. So there are differences. In the case of Germany, the question comes up: should we waive the minimum wage? Should we create 100,000 subpar jobs? In the United States, the market, quote unquote, the market resolves those things itself. So there's.
But maybe we made a mistake thinking that when in 70s many immigrants came to Germany, or when at the end of, or at the turn from 19th to 20th century, many immigrants came to America, they joined the same society. Maybe it was a segmentary society, few societies. Like Brexit began when immigrants came and didn't create enclaves like Pakistanis or Indians used to do. Poles came and they are everywhere. They don't need to be drunk, they don't need to swear, they are just close. For someone who is like 60 years old, Englishman from a town, it's unbelievable not to speak English. So maybe it is really like a question of homogeneity. Maybe we made the mistake thinking that something like an immigrant society existed before.
Well, e pluribus unum has always been a challenge, and how to effectuate it is the challenge of liberal politics. So we used to rely on certain categories like public and private to do some of that work. One of the reason I mentioned the whole global justice issue is that it accompanied a generation of multiculturalism, which took apart that public-private distinction. So you would be Muslim or Jewish not only at home, but also in your public presentation. You would demand of the school system that it not serve pork in the school lunches. All of these challenges, which came under a different concept of liberalism, make the E Pluribus Unum more difficult project. I don't want to go as far as what you're suggesting Walzer suggested, which for him would be a retreat as well from his prior positions on the irreducibility of biological homogeneity.
Let me propose something risky, perhaps. How can we overcome, again, the question, these dangerous, destructive movements based on ethnic identity? And one answer is by building the right institutions. Let me use an example from a former student who says the nation state is all important for the willingness of people to pay taxes. We are quite willing in Germany to subsidize through our taxes or higher prices Bavarian dairy farmers, because we know them. They are part of our community. We have visited them. But as it comes to subsidizing through our taxes, Spanish olive growers, the willingness to share or the sense of solidarity is much reduced. That is, as an empirical fact, that is right. However, if we, as a thought experiment, think about an institutional change at the level of the European Union, think we have a European finance minister who has a budget that has been approved by the European Parliament, and the European finance minister has legitimate taxing powers. Then the cognitive horizon of people who benefit from the taxes and pay the taxes would be quite different due to this institutional change, and we would come to the conclusion that the olive growers in Spain have the same right, the same entitlement to agricultural subsidies as have the Bavarian. So it all depends upon the institutional setup rather than the history and the ingrained Zusammengehörigkeitsgefühl, the sense of fellowship and belonging together that you refer to. So this is flexible, and the reference unit that we are interested in here can also extend beyond the European Union. I mean, if we understand that our habits of eating and buying clothes has giant long-distance causal effects upon, if we look at the consumption of cotton materials, 60 pieces per year in America per person, right? 60 pieces of, that has consequences for the erosion in Uzbekistan. Terrible consequences, and for climate change and all kinds of our consumption habits have long-term, if we had institutions that could regulate the intake of raw materials in our lifestyle, then we would realize that such a long-term a long-range causation exists, and we need to do something. What goes on in Indonesia with palm oil, or in Latin America with soy and maize production, is all dependent upon our style of consumption. The absence of institutions that regulate our consumption in view of the long-term, long-distance allows us to ignore this, allows us to fail our arguably existent duties of solidarity vis-à-vis the people affected by our negative externalities. So it's all a matter of building institutions rather than traditional identities.
It's also a matter of obtaining democratic legitimacy for those institutions, and that has proven to be a rather significant problem.
Okay, so my last question would be, I would like to refer to economy at least once. I had also an impression that Michael Walzer is a little bit disappointed with the left and like shifting slowly, but still to more centrist positions. And it associates me with the two schools of explanation of populism in Poland. Like we used to have, on the left side, we used to think that the rise of populism comes from the cost of neoliberal policy. On the more in the center, like people like Adam Michnik used to explain right-wing populism or the genealogy of Jarosław Kaczyński party by the certain amount of Poles that are just nationalists, and it's like genetic nationalism. And people like Walzer, but not only him, I think are less and less convinced that the structural reason is just economy. But if so, then even if someone like Trump or Front National, so because like West is 2 steps from the real collapse, even if it's not going to happen, then those structural reasons will stay with us. I don't see much change in it. I don't see much change in rising inequalities and all those things that we know perfectly well from years, and the West still doesn't do it. And one last thing is. Something that used to be not maybe forget, but even didn't appear in the analysis of book by Thomas Piketty is that the only moment when inequalities decreased were big catastrophes.
Big catastrophes and strong labor movements.
Rather hyperinflation after catastrophes than social movements or working movements. I'm sorry. I would love to be the conversely, but it's rather not. So how strong are by like 2016? What's your belief that it's really economy that explains the rise of right-wing populism now in the West?
Okay, there's a big debate whether it is the residue of culture wars or whether this is fueled by economic precariousness and the consequences of globalization. And are the right-wing populist globalization losers? The evidence that I have seen over the last year is negative. It is a mix of culture wars and precariousness and losing in the process of globalization. And it's a complex causation, but you can also say it is the consequence of the disappearance of a welfare state and the forces that promote and defend the welfare state, namely social democracy. It is an open question, and we have not yet a full analysis of the phenomenon, but it is very clear that this phenomenon that we are talking about, right-wing populism, is changing not just the societies and their party systems and their forms of representation and their public culture and the degree of liberal realization of liberal rights, but it is also changing international relations in a very serious sense, and we know that in the European Union, and there is every good reason to think about institutional changes that can overcome the phenomenon, or at least domesticate and tame its potential destructive implications. I think you don't know that, but the habit is, the routine is to
that's what I wanted to do. We have still like 15 minutes for
Okay, well, just one word to that. I can't speak to Europe, but I think in the United States, class war is still an alternative to ethno-national conflict. As the Sanders campaign showed, there is, at least in the United States, a sufficient amount of inequality and a sufficiently non-exhausted welfare model that the reproletarianization of a working class that rose through the glorious years of capitalism does have a left-wing possible outcome. I don't know if Corbyn represents that or if that's a different set of issues, but I think it's not inevitably a right-wing.
So who wanna? Okay, so we have we have 4 questions. So let's maybe start with the guest in the middle, then Ivan, David, and our friend on the back.
Yeah, Paul Taylor. I'd like to take Klaus Offe up on his view that there would be wide public consent for a European finance minister with a legitimized budget from the European Parliament spending money as needs required within Europe rather than along national lines. How do you get German taxpayers to consent, German voters to consent to that? Because that's the 64,000 euro question, I think, for the future of the EU. And so far we've failed, which is why the Eurozone is a very precarious halfway house.
Ivan, let's collect questions if you agree, okay?
I was surprised that when you were going back why ethnic nationalism is such a powerful identity, you didn't touch on another identity that was very much weakened, which was universalist and competing with this, and this was the religious one. In a certain way, I remember 1999, basically Tony Blair came to Bulgaria to try to mobilize support for the operation in Kosovo and said, I'm doing here what Gladstone did in 1976 for you. But it was very different. Gladstone was asking for solidarity with the Christians in the Ottoman Empire, those who were like us. While Blair said the new universalism is having solidarity with those who are not like us. And I do believe from this point of view, this previous type of universalism on the level of Christianity has an institution behind it. It was the church. And what we see these days is very much nationalization of the religious identities. You expect a very kind of a Christian country like Poland to jump in the beginning of the Syrian crisis and say, we all want all Christians to come here. I didn't see much of it. And from this point of view, I do believe this is one of the arguments that really is interesting. It is particularly for the West. Weakening of the religious identity makes ethnic identity so strong. In the Middle East, where the religious identity is strong, you're going to see some of the ethnic identity being weakened. And secondly, the weakening of the state leads to ethnization of the state. Particularly, part of the strength of the state was its assimilation capacity. But now the state basically is not allowed to assimilate much. And then when you're asking how we know that it's a Bulgarian state because it's our state, basically populated mostly by Bulgarians. And I do believe from this point of view, paradoxically, these 2 elements, in my view, very much also contribute to the real default strength of the ethnic national identity.
But would you agree that religion is post-ideological or not, even?
Could be pre and could be post.
Okay, David Ross.
Yeah, just a quick observation. Frank Parkin, a long time ago, criticized Marxists for naively expecting universalism, when in fact, those who are endangered and trying to protect their own interests seek smaller types of communities. He called it mechanisms of social closure through trade unions. He was kind of critical of that, but I think, historically, right, trade unions have been on the left, that smaller institution that have been able to capitalize on defending smaller communities and pushing a wider agenda. We know trade unions are in crisis, but I think it's almost like I have a sense that we're so used to the fact that trade unions are in crisis or going down that we may miss their key importance in building up a counterforce to that radical right, because without that medium organization, that smaller type of social collectivity, of class collectivity, right, then it's hard to build and regain that broader class collectivity that we're all missing here, that we're all, nostalgic for. Thanks.
Okay, and the gentleman in the back.
Yeah. About 2 months ago, I conducted a workshop in Vienna. I'm Austrian. I've been Austrian since 2000, but I still encounter questions like, yes, and where are you from? And I keep on asking the question to myself, how long am I going to be encountering this question of, where are you from? I'm not surprised, because Zygmunt Bauman has talked about it in his concept of the concept of strangers as terrorists, also as people who make those, for instance, within the dominant groups and societies afraid of this stranger being a potential terrorist, just threatening your sense of being. But in this workshop, I asked people to explain who they were, what their identities were, and how they related to Austria. And 3 of the participants said, I'm Turkish, I'm born here, I was born in Austria, but I feel Turkish and I will feel Turkish forever. And 2 others, one of them young woman, all of them actually aged 20, said the same things. And after the workshop, I asked them, during the recess, I said, I wondered why you said that, because you're 20 years old. Aren't you citizens? Yes, they said, we're citizens, but we're taking what we believe the country took from our fathers as guest workers. But we do not identify with this country. And I said, how's that? And they said, well, can't you see how I look like? And I said, what am I going to say about how I look like? And I think this bio aspect of ethnicity and belonging that you mentioned here is very, very important. That's never going to get away from those of us who look different. And where is the onus, or whose responsibility is it then to take that away from concepts of belonging? And I really am very sympathetic to the idea of let's build institutions, because I think in my own way of belonging to Austria, I think it's institutions that have helped me. But it doesn't help when, for instance, I tried to do a little bit of activism just by talking, for instance, to taxi drivers and asking them. There are many Egyptian Austrians, Turkish Austrians. I use this hyphenation because actually I believe that that's a better way of identifying them than the way they identify themselves. And they've said, no, I'm Egyptian, I'm not going to participate in the next election. I'm trying to try to mobilize people to participate in the next election. And a lot of these people will say, no, I'm not. Not even Filipino communities, for instance. They said, no, we voted for this crazy guy, Duterte, in the Philippines. I say crazy, they didn't say crazy, but we voted for Duterte, but we're not voting in the presidential election here because we don't feel we belong. There are many, for instance, who are in their, towards their 30s now, and who say, I'll never be able to feel Austrian because the Austrians do not make me feel Austrian because of the, and I said, you know, why? Because of the way I look. Now, I wonder whether you mentioned Benedict Anderson. A few months before he passed away, he came to Vienna for the Southeast Asian Studies Seminar or conference. This was summer 2014. And I tried to pin him down. I said, don't you feel responsible for your idea of imagined communities? I feel very, very strongly for this or against this concept, because I think it is that imagination, the concept of imagination, the concept of image that has gone haywire. And he accepted it. He said, look, why is it that people are running after me on imagined communities? This came out in 1983, right? It was reprinted in 1991. But he said, I wrote many other things after that. He wrote, for instance, The Spectre of Comparisons. I pinned him down on imagined communities because he used the Philippine national hero as one of the reasons for imagining the nation and imagining building the nation state. And I said, why did you use the novel? The Philippine national hero wrote 2 novels, a sequel. No Limitang Hero, or Don't Touch Me, means don't touch me in the Philippines because I am suffering from a social cancer. This was a message in the 1880s to the Spanish regime. And the abuses, because of the abuses of the Spanish friars or priests in the Philippines, who were in fact the rulers in the colonial government. But I said, why did you use that in order to say the Philippine national hero imagined the Filipino nation, when in fact he was criticizing, you know, the way the Filipino nation was being built? And he said, well, why don't you do something about saying he wrote a second book? And he said, I believe the second book is more important. And in fact, that's true, because the second book is about the subversive. His hero in the first book becomes in the second book the subversive, somebody who takes on different nationalities and personalities, including becoming a Jew in the Philippines at that time and undermining the whole system. And what I'm at is that there is probably something that is overestimated about imagining as communities rather than envisioning the communities, which would go along with envisioning an institution that would help to bring about solidarity. And let's do away with this image of, you know, how do you look, and therefore you are a stranger. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very last question, I hope, real question, not a hidden commentary, from the gentleman at the back. If there is a lady, then it's not going to be the last question. Okay, so we're going to have 2 questions.
I would like to pick up the discourse on institutions that Klaus Offe started. And you started with the notion of a lack of institutions. But in your last sentence, you swifted to institution building. And this makes a big difference, because blaming the lack of institutions opens the space for exactly populists. Because on the one hand, they offer an answer by offering a strong leader, and on the other hand, what they do is to blame the others for the situation when we have a lack of institutions. And this is connected to what you said earlier. You said the concept of the liberal concept of the individual is obsolete. No, it is not obsolete. It's in a crisis, and that's the problem, because institutions are not given by God. Institutions are built up by men, and they are built up and filled with life by individuals. And it's individuals that take responsibility for their own life, for the life of their brothers, for the life of their family, their nation, for mankind, which build these institutions. So the real problem is a crisis of the concept of a responsible liberal individual.
Okay. And the lady here.
I'd just like to take up this idea that we have a portfolio and a mixture of identities. Obviously, many people also have mixed ethnicities because people move. My own parents were war refugees. Now, in defence of UK attitudes to Poles and to Romanians, I'd just like to say that the BBC is currently broadcasting a series of lectures by Kwame Anthony Appiah, who's half Ghanese and half English and has American citizenship, which also suggests that the idea of any single identity may be mistaken, and that a more relaxed connection between people and a more open idea of identity may be helpful, because identities and traditions can be and are constantly transformed and created and recreated. Now, in connection with this, it seems to me that the word solidarity today has quite a hard and even dated ring. Solidarity was and is born of rage and of resistance. So I wonder if it's not worth thinking in less inflexible sounding terms, thinking more of in terms of trust, as you suggested, and conversation, both institutionally and personally. And looking at an alternative, a more malleable, flexible concept of who we are as peoples and as economies and as human beings, so that we can share more widely. Last thing I'd like to say is I don't think Britain is a lost cause.
Okay. You know, Kwame at Princeton teaches human rights. If he would believe in the human rights, he would lose a good job. And this is actually the same for us. So thanking you, thanking my guests, thanking organizers, I wanted to appeal, don't lose our faith in liberal democracy. Thank you very much. You want it? Yeah. Because there were mostly commentary. Okay, please.
I mean, if we have time, briefly. To Paul Taylor, very much agree. Enormous political difficulties to build institutions that cover a broader, wider scope. However, that is a necessity that is recognized by everyone who calls for a European finance minister instead of six-pack and two-pack and regulation of national budgets. We need a European finance minister in order to regulate the externalities and the interdependencies of budget. It is very hard to sell this to the German public, no doubt, but there are counteracting tendencies. The functional need is not yet realized by voters in Germany and other countries. Even the nice thing about, I mean, you're right, nationalization of religion. At the same time, the nice thing about Roman Catholicism is that it is an internationalist religion, and in that sense universalist, and unfortunately there is no equivalent to the Pope in either the Protestant church nor in Islam, and we would urgently need such an institution of a supranational, so that religions cannot be hijacked by national interest. David, I mean, the answer is that we are in a process. I mean, what remains of the welfare states, they are moving in the direction of what I call fiscalization. Rather than contributions, we finance unemployment, health, and pensions to an increasing extent through taxes. And I think this is a very welcome development, and it will be extended into the future. The reference unit is citizenship rather than being employed or being employed for such and such years, and the eventual solution to one problem of social security will be a universal basic income, which is based on citizenship rather than on employment status for so many years and so on. So building a floor as a citizenship right rather than the small scale logic of social security funds. I found it very interesting what you said about Austria and the experience of non-Austrian born people there. We know that national identities are strengthened among migrants who see themselves as losers or as being rejected. A Turkish friend of mine who was recently visiting in Vienna told me that the number of people who have the traditional women who have the traditional dress in the Turkish neighborhoods of Vienna are much greater than anything you see in Vienna, in Istanbul, for that matter. So this is not surprising that we find this strengthening of identities among the losers in the migrant community. You find also the opposite, namely the denial of the background and up to the change of names so that you're not identifiable as a migrant. So both these opposite tendencies can be observed and are quite familiar. And then finally, I want to say something about institutions. Your point on your doubts about institution building. Institutions have a cognitive dimension. They widen your horizon. They make you realize that there are other participants in the game that institutions organize. And if you I mean, the example is, of course, in Prussia in 1842, you had welfare only at the place where you come from, where you are born. You have to go back, if you depend on welfare, you have to go back to the place where you are born. In 1842, this has been generalized, and a Prussian office for poor relief and welfare has been created. It widens the horizon and the awareness of the phenomenon, and that is one of the virtues of institutions, that they define the relevant community of people who have a claim to what institutions do.
I would just add a couple of words to what Claus has just said. First, in regard to Ivan, so the Catholic Church is indeed an internationalist organization, and in many countries a leading advocate of immigrants, and runs afoul of the state on the question of immigration in many places. On the other hand, there are countries where Catholics are a minority and have demonstrated their loyalty by being very nationalist. So the U.S. Catholic Church is sharply divided between immigrant-friendly internationalists and militant patriots, defenders of the country. One even sees that in the election this year. Poland is a macro version of that, stuck between Orthodox Russia and Lutheran Prussia or Germany. The national and religious identities are so intertwined, everybody knows. I don't have to say anything about that. But the mixture of demos and ethnos for Catholic activists is a little bit different. On Tony, the reaction, it's Tony, right? The reaction formation in amongst immigrants in places like Austria is indeed a sign of the sense of alienation one sees that as a constant threat in African American culture as well, this reaction formation to being excluded. On the other hand, having watched German, not so much Austrian, but German television over the years, I would keep my eye on the advertising to see if there is a slow television advertising to see if there's a slow transition from nationality to ethnicity. It may be that Austria is incapable of ironically, that Austria would be incapable of multi-ethnic identity. And lastly, we have forgotten sometimes the end of the French Declaration. It's the Declaration of the Rights of Man or mankind, people, and citizen. And the agency, it's citizenship, which is the agency for the realization of universal rights. And I don't know that the establishment of international institutions can do the same thing unless there is a citizenship analog to the institutional institutions.
My passport says that's first European Union.
And actually in Austria, David Alaba is one of the most frequently person who appears on advertisement, and I think advertises one of the biggest banks in Austria. And he's Austrian of African origins, playing for Nigerian origins, playing. Okay, I didn't know that. Okay, now really thank you very much to the public. Thank you very much to David Abraham and Klaus Offe and the organizers.
Thank you very much. The conference Mobilizing for the Commons 10th Anniversary Solidarity Conference and 27th European Meeting of Cultural Journals is finished.